people pleasing is a little bit selfish. Oftentimes when we say yes to things that we truly want to say no to, or we don't have the capacity to do, we aren't going to be able to show up as our best self. We might show up with resentment. So sometimes saying no is the empathetic choice. Masking is a defense mechanism. It's a way to cope with your symptoms by being aware of them and trying to do the opposite of them.
Women can feel really guilty, though, in saying no and not showing up and doing everything for everyone and doing it perfectly. How can people start to deal with that guilt and process it in a healthy way?
Meredith Carder
is an ADHD coach, author, and community builder who helps adults with ADHD feel seen, supported, and empowered.
With a background in psychology and business and decades of lived experience.
She's the creator of The Hummingbird Hive and author of It All Makes Sense Now.
People with ADHD, one of the things we really struggle with is emotional regulation. Sometimes we get very closed off emotionally. And emotional regulation is actually not part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. It used to be, and then it was taken out mainly because
the masking piece that you brought up, what's the connection between the masking and the people-pleasing that we see people do?
I think there's a huge connection there. I think a lot of the time what's happening is...
Welcome to the Dr. Brighten Show, where we burn the BS in women's health to the ground. I'm your host, Dr. Jolene Brighten, and if you've ever been dismissed, told your symptoms are normal or just in your head, or been told just to deal with it, this show is for you. And if while listening to this, you decide you like this kind of content, I invite you to head over to drbrighten.com, where you'll find free guides, twice weekly podcast releases, and a ton of resources to support you on your journey. Let's dive in. Why do so many ADHD women become chronic people pleasers, and what can we do about it?
I think there's so many reasons that can happen, but I think the main reason would be that most women with ADHD are diagnosed later in life. So they spend their whole childhood feeling like something's different and they don't know what it is. So they get a lot of feedback about their behavior and how they show up in the world. And over time, they start to try to overcorrect so much for their ADHD symptoms. So they begin over-delivering. They begin saying yes to everything. And they are really just trying to avoid the shame they felt their whole life for not understanding how their brain worked.
Mm-hmm. And so women getting diagnosed with ADHD a lot later in life, was that true for you?
Yes, I was diagnosed following my daughter's diagnosis.
Oh my gosh, same. It was my son. And then they're like, wait a minute.
Yeah, it's a common story. And I think that what happens is we're filling out all these assessments and paperwork and hearing ourselves in these symptoms. So it's kind of like those light bulbs start going off.
Mm-hmm. So for women who have been in this pattern of people pleasing most of their life, if not all of their life, how can they start to take steps to break free of that?
I think the first step is really working on that self-awareness piece, understanding your ADHD symptoms and not just what those symptoms are, but how they're driving so many other behaviors in your life. So first, it's that piece of noticing it more. And then once you start noticing it, you can develop strategies to pause before you say yes, to evaluate the true intention of the things that you are committing to. And for me, it looked like rehearsing language that I could use to give myself some space between the ask and the pressure to make the decision. So I knew I needed to do that ahead of time. I'm impulsive. I have the hyperactive type ADHD. And so I knew that oftentimes that yes was going to come out of my mouth almost immediately. So when I worked to try to unwind some of that behavior, I came up with some phrases I could say to give myself some time to consider.
Women can feel really guilty, though, in saying no and not showing up and doing everything for everyone and doing it perfectly. How can people start to deal with that guilt and process it in a healthy way?
What was a game changer for me was realizing that sometimes people pleasing is a little bit selfish. Oftentimes, when we say yes to things that we truly want to say no to, or we don't have the capacity to do, we aren't going to be able to show up as our best self. We might show up with resentment, and that's going to show through in our interactions. So if we're able to say no, that person can find someone to do that task or help them with that thing that is giving them a true yes, that really does want to take on that task. So I've really tried to reframe it as sometimes saying no is the empathetic choice.
I love that. I love the reframe. And I think that's something you do really well in your book, is taking people of like, this is what we're doing. These are the patterns. And here's we can start to reframe what most of society has told us and look at it differently. You talked about the hyperactive type of ADHD. Can you talk a little bit about the different types of ADHD? Because I think this is what lends primarily to a lot of women being missed in not getting the diagnosis when they should have.
Yeah, there are 3 subtypes of ADHD. There is ADHD, primarily hyperactive impulsive type. There is ADHD, primarily inattentive type, which if you hear the term ADD isn't a term that's used as a separate diagnosis anymore. It hasn't been since the 80s, but it's still used quite often to describe what is now called inattentive ADHD subtype. And then there's the third type, which is combined type. And that means that you have enough symptoms that fall into the hyperactive impulsive type and the inattentive type.
Can we give people who are new to this just kind of like an example of each of these? So what is the archetype? Like what is the, the typical like textbook diagnosis of this person? I say that with air quotes because as we expand our understanding of all neurodivergent conditions, we start to understand, much like everything else, nobody fits into a perfect textbook description.
Yeah, I'm so glad you added that piece because it is so true. There's so much that comes from our conditioning and how we may mask our symptoms. But to give you a general overview, the hyperactive impulsive type is really similar to how it sounds. So the symptoms that fall under that umbrella are lots of times needing to move, fidgeting. There is oftentimes, especially for women, it shows up as talking very quickly. I was called Meredith the Mouth as a child. It also can show up as a need to be busy, like packing our schedule with a lot of things. So sometimes the people pleasing isn't about actually trying to please someone. It's just trying to like put as much on their calendar as we can. And then the impulsivity is just like it sounds, like we are not having that pause between a thought and a decision and acting very impulsively. For inattentive type, that is the struggle to direct our attention to what is most important in the moment. Oftentimes in school, that's the kid that's daydreaming. As an adult, it's that person that is losing their focus at work that can't get through a meeting, or you can probably see it in conversations you have with people with ADHD where you're like, oh, I think they're somewhere else right now. So it is that struggle to keep attention on the task. And then there's all these other symptoms that fall under both umbrellas. And most of those fall under struggles with executive functioning. So things like struggles with working memory, prioritization, pacing, self-regulation. And there's several more that fall under that umbrella.
Yeah, I think that's helpful for people to understand because most people who are unfamiliar with ADHD have it in their mind that you're bouncing off the walls, that you're somebody always fidgeting, shaking your legs, like, you are the person who can't sit still and you're failing in life in so many ways. And we can fail in life in some ways. It feels like failure, but not always necessarily true that it is. However, there's a lot of ways that ADHD can show up. And I think that's important for people to understand that it's not just that one picture of the small little boy who can't sit still in school, who, is racing around at recess. It can show up in a lot of different ways. So I want to ask you, the masking piece that you brought up, what's the connection between the masking and the people pleasing that we see people do?
I think there's a huge connection there. I think a lot of the time what's happening is girls are socialized to be the compliant little girl in class. And if they are having to, hear a lot of negative feedback early on, it doesn't take us long before we start really performing in the way we think society wants us to show up. So oftentimes that looks like saying yes to things that we probably don't even want to do or aren't prepared to do. I think oftentimes we're trying to avoid that shame we feel when we have not been the person we think others expected us to be.
I just realized I brought up masking. We both have brought up masking, but we haven't really defined that. And I think for some people, it might be the first time they're hearing that. So can you explain what masking is?
Masking is a defense mechanism. It's a way to cope with your symptoms by being aware of them and trying to do the opposite of them. So an example might be if you are having a need to move quite a bit and you know that that's distracting to your teacher and she's told you didn't like that. So instead you are spending all your focus sitting in that classroom and being aware of your body and thinking about only that. So you are literally putting on a mask and covering up your symptoms so that others don't see them. Oftentimes I see this in adults more like I have a big friend group with ADHD and oftentimes we love connecting, we love talking, and a lot of us are really self-monitoring because we know we interrupt. We know we talk too fast. So sometimes that will look like a person that that is quite charismatic going quiet. And oftentimes they've hit that moment where they're like, oh, I've talked too much. I've got to walk it back. I'm going to mask that need to connect in that way and not participate in the conversation.
You have a daughter with ADHD. Do you feel like just from observing her and having worked with clients, does it seem like pretty easy for her to pick up masking? Like she moves into it pretty easily? Because I know for you and I, we're high masking individuals, obviously, because you show up online, we're having a conversation right now. We're not interrupting each other. But I just am curious from that perspective. And the reason why I ask this question is because I have a son and it is so clear to me that masking is just not intuitive to him at all. Like he doesn't pick up on the cues that I should start learning how to fit into this. And I look at that and I almost wonder I feel this is my intuition. Society gives him a lot more leadway to misbehave, and misbehave in terms of not following society's norms. And I feel like for girls, it becomes something it's a lot easier to step into masking because of those societal pressures. But I don't have a girl. I just was once a girl.
Yeah. I actually have a son that has ADHD too.
Okay.
My daughter was diagnosed first. Yes, I do. I have, and they present pretty differently, which is really interesting. And I think that's such an interesting question that you bring up. I definitely had noticed, especially prior to her diagnosis, that she figured out masking quite early. It took a while to land on ADHD with her, even though it seemed very clear to me because she masked so heavily at school. She was that stereotypical child that is like, oh, we don't have any behavior problems at school. And then she would come home and it was like an emotional explosion every day. And we were having a very hard time. And what's really interesting about her is when she got diagnosed and we started treating the ADHD and I started working with her and coaching her and helping her understand her brain and how to accommodate her symptoms versus mask her symptoms. I don't think she masks as much anymore. One thing she did that I found so fascinating is when COVID hit and school went online, one of the first things she did when she set up her little workspace, she was a 5th grader at the time, is she took a little exercise band and put it on the the legs of her chair, and that was to bounce her feet on, because she knew she needed to fidget. She knew she had had that accommodation at school, and it really helped her. And it was less distracting to the teacher than her like falling out of her chair or doing something that's noisy or something like that. So I think because we've been able to work with her about self-accommodating, I don't think she feels the need to mask. She's actually a very confident girl now. She really channels her hyperactivity in a really valuable way. She's a captain on her cheer team and does a lot of really, she's very busy and is able to just kind of live her life in a way that makes sense for her. But she was definitely masking so much when she was younger that they were trying to understand if it was anxiety or ADHD.
Yeah.
And it really was a lot different with my son. He leans more inattentive. He's a combined type, but his inattentive symptoms, I think, show up quite a bit more for him. But the more we've treated his ADHD, the more the hyperactive is shining through. So I think he was masking a little bit, but I think you're 100% right that he just doesn't seem to see his behaviors as a problem as much as my daughter did. He sort of was like, well, I'm a boy. And he wasn't really getting the negative feedback that my daughter was early on. And I think that, like you said, we just give boys a lot more leeway, and we don't ask them to cover it up quite as much.
Yeah. I want to talk about accommodations because I think this helps adults as much as it helps children as well. What I will say though about, all of this conversation about masking that I find really interesting is that you're like, we can accommodate, we can shift things so we're not masking. With my son, so we're ADHD. And I find often, so for people who don't know what that is, autism and ADHD, because my brain just likes to keep it interesting. But with that, there's times where I'm explaining to him social interactions and he's like, but why? Why do we have to do it like that? And I'm honestly like, I don't know. I just learned over time that this is how people are. And I'm like, I don't actually understand it myself. And it's so funny because we'll turn to my husband, both of us, and be like, explain this to us. Cause like, we actually don't understand this. And so I think that's another layer. But we were talking about this concept of not having to mask. I want to talk about the accommodation. How can we make it so that we're masking less? However, I think people need to understand why masking is an issue, because there's a lot of people who are like, I'm high masking. I'm very successful. People like me. I have friends. Like, this is a good thing. Why would I ever want to not mask? So can you talk a little bit about what I call the mask tax or the toll you have to pay for masking?
Yeah, there's definitely a mask task. I haven't heard that before. There's certainly costs to masking. I think it's such a nuanced conversation because we do have to mask at times. Every human does at some point in their life have to not show up as their 100% authentic self in every moment. But when we are constantly masking so many things about us, we are directing all of our bandwidth to that. So if you're sitting in a meeting and all you can think about is how uncomfortable you are in that seat, but you won't let yourself get up and stand or find a way to fidget that's not distracting to others, then you're not absorbing what you're supposed to be learning, or you can't participate as your full self. So you are probably really tired after that meeting, and you probably also are going to need to put some additional work into like learning that information on your own or talking with someone to get the information that you missed. There's physical costs to masking. I think oftentimes when we're just pushing through and thinking about how we're showing up all of the time, it's just exhausting. So oftentimes as people get older and they get even more self-aware of other people's perceptions, we get better at masking, but we start paying even bigger costs. So a lot of times with adult women, that cost is burnout. We get there quite a bit faster than someone that might be in an identical situation because we are directing so much mental bandwidth into those masking behaviors.
And for anyone who's listening to this that is neurodivergent, that's like, oh, I've been in burnout before, or maybe what it was called was adrenal fatigue, or more scientifically accurate is HP, dysregulation. That is the physical hormonal toll that masking takes. So you can feel like when people say adrenal fatigue or adrenal burnout, it's not scientifically accurate. If you've ever been there, that's what it feels like. You're like, I just feel like my adrenal glands are not making cortisol. It doesn't spike, doesn't wake me up in the morning, doesn't actually help me when I'm in a stressful situation, or when I am in a stressful situation, I hit bottom even faster. And, there was that interesting study that came out recently showing that women who are neurodivergent, ADHD specifically, they have a higher mortality risk. And part of that, so there's a lot of factors that go into that, and we need to replicate research and we need to follow people around for a while, but certainly burnout is part of that. And the masking is contributing to the burnout as well. So for people who are like masking, not great. And I do want to say, you said as a defense mechanism, I want to add on to that it's also a survival mechanism, because, I will see a lot of people on social media who are like, drop your masks, stop masking. I mean, it's not always safe. It is not always safe not to mask. You could lose your job because people are like, why'd you say the weird thing? Why are you doing this thing? Like, this is not how we expect. You're not doing anything necessarily wrong. You're still performing. There's a lot of ways that it can be not safe for you. So masking is also a way that we survive. And with that being said, though, I think it's great if you can take weekends where you don't have to mask. My birthday this year, I was like, I'm not masking today. I'm not hanging out with anybody. I'm going to do what I want. That's what I'm going to gift myself for my birthday. How can people start to drop the mask? And then I want to start talking about accommodations as well.
Yeah, I think it really starts with understanding when you are masking and being thoughtful about what would be the cost of dropping the mask. Oftentimes we just revert to masking everything when we're masking things that don't necessarily have a big impact. So thinking about that first, being like, what are the masks that really actually are protecting me that I probably need to keep using for a time? And then thinking about what are the safe spaces where I can unmask. So if you know that you are in the type of role at work where you feel like you're masking all day, think about how you spend your time outside of your work hours. It might need to be a little bit different than what you're doing now. Think about how you're spending your lunch break if you get one. Maybe instead of networking with coworkers, you need to go sit outside and regulate and allow yourself to just be. So thinking about breaks from the mask, I think is really important, and just really doing that evaluation about like, is it important to mask this thing? Like, I think I keep coming back to fidgeting today. Maybe it's because I'm sitting here like this. Like, I don't move.
It's the mics. I'm going to tell everybody it's the mics. And I'm like, I need to find something else because I move a lot, but then I feel like I have to have this regulated.
Yeah.
I'm like, I need a different situation.
I know, like you need the mic. Yes. So that fidgeting example is, it's like most of the time fidgeting really is not that big of a deal. Yes, it may send a message to someone like, oh, they're moving around a lot. Maybe they're neurodivergent. Usually it's people that are in the know. But if we just find a way to fidget and get that out that isn't noisy or loud, that can help a lot. So instead of like trying to just sit there like this, like being so still and not moving, thinking about like, what can I have in this meeting that's not quite as noticeable? And there's fidget rings. Some people really like those.
Well, actually, this is not, this is a Mexican jewelry designer. And when I came across her stuff, I was like, this is a perfect fidget. I have my little pinky ring that I'll play with as well. But they also have the rings that spin. There's the ones with the balls. So we should link to some on Amazon, actually, to show people what we're talking about. But yeah, I always look for jewelry that I can play with that nobody is like noticing I'm playing with.
Yeah. So it's like not as distracting. Like I know for a long time, I had a coworker and he clicked his pen all the time. Like that is noisy. And we noticed that. So, I didn't know I was neurodivergent at the time, but I related to his need to move around because I was masking it.
Yeah. But before your period, you're like, click that that one
Yes.
time, and you're going to see the bad side of me.
Exactly. It's those noises. Our filtering systems in our brain pick up on so much. So some of those things the things that we do can also drive us crazy as well. And we can be very sensitive to them. So thinking about can I fidget in a way instead of having to mask it and try to be perfectly still and direct so much mental energy in that? What can be a way that's not going to draw attention to me and distract from, the purpose of why I'm gathering with people? That would be something to think about versus emotional regulation is a big struggle for a lot of people with ADHD. So sometimes we get very closed off emotionally. And at times that's one that you might not want to go totally unmasked at work, losing our temper, being able to blurt something out before thinking about it. That might be a mask that is actually helping us a little bit. So thinking about, okay, this is having a big toll. How can I find different ways to maybe regulate myself so that I don't get as dysregulated and I don't have to mask as much, but I can't just let myself be full, authentic and say everything that pops into my brain because it might be hurtful and it might come back and hurt myself as well.
Mm-hmm. You also talked about having the band on the chair for your daughter. Something that we've used with my son is taking those adhesive Velcro strips and putting those underneath a workspace so that one side is scratchy, one side is soft, so there can be that sensory stimulation going on. For a while, we had a tub, I had a plastic tub full of those little plastic balls. Yes, they probably have phthalates, and yes, it's not great, but we filled it with these balls, and then he could put his feet in and just play with these balls. Or sometimes, there's an exercise for plantar fasciitis that we do with a water bottle and rolling a water bottle on the ground and lifting it up with your toes. And sometimes I would just put that on the ground and be like, you can play with that while you're doing it. Are there other things that you use with clients that you're this helps so that they can fidget, that they can get some stimulation and get some energy out in some ways while they're working?
Yeah, I think oftentimes, this was actually inspired by my daughter as well. She kind of figured out as she got farther into junior high and high school that she didn't really like how obvious some of her accommodations were that were in her IEP. So she communicated to her teachers that if they needed the attendance ran down to the office or they needed some kind of errand to run, please pick me if you can, because that helped her get up and move. That was one of her accommodations is movement breaks. But it looks a little awkward when you're hey, I need a movement break when you're a teenager. Yeah. So that communication can help. And how that I think can translate into the workforce is if you work for yourself, give yourself those breaks. That's easy if you are self-employed and you are in a role where you're working from home and you can get up and move and kind of recalibrate and get some of that hyperactivity out. If you're not, think about how can you communicate to the people leading meetings, being hey, a lot of us have noticed that these 3-hour meetings are really hard on our focus. Can we take a couple of quick built-in breaks and ask for accommodations that probably help everyone on your team? And also thinking about if you're in a position at work to kind of direct what you're assigned. Say, hey, these are my strengths. I really do well with these types of tasks, and choose tasks that allow you some novelty and variety throughout your day and opportunities to get up and move and talk to people in other departments and kind of naturally meet that need to move and kind of not be in that same spot thinking about the same thing all day.
Yeah. As you're talking about this, I'm I don't know that the tech community is, all neurodivergent, but I feel there's got to be enough neurodivergent there because when my husband, he's worked in several tech companies, there were ball chairs everywhere. Walking desks everywhere, ping pong table breaks were happening. There was one place where he worked and there was actually an indoor basketball court. And there were all of these things where people were always getting movement in their day. And I look at that and I'm these were all accommodations that every workplace could really use. And yet you see them specifically in the tech sector.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. And I don't know if it's because they are diving into the research a little bit more. Maybe they're ahead of the curve for like organizational development. I used to work in training and development, and tech companies did seem like they were considering that a little bit more. Probably because it's linked to higher productivity for everyone, and it's beneficial and it helps their bottom line. But if it's a win-win for everyone, I think that's so helpful to integrate those things. And I think what's been interesting since COVID and a lot of those jobs have gone to remote is that oftentimes people were having those moments during the day, and then they find themselves working from home in a role where they technically have more freedom, but they don't always build any of that in because it's just not intuitive anymore. You're not looking at the ping pong table over there and thinking, oh, I'm going to take this ping pong break. You're not thinking about those things quite as much. So often, if you are one of those workers that used to have a very active environment, sometimes you have to think about how can you recreate that in your new setting.
I want to talk about time perception because that's definitely an issue that a lot of ADHDers struggle with. Why is time just so weird for the ADHD brain?
You know, it falls under that executive function umbrella. We really have a hard time perceiving time. We really struggle with time, knowing how long things will take. We struggle with losing track of time and feeling time passing. So it's not always a like, oh, people with ADHD are always late. A lot of times I think people think it's a time management thing, like they're just not managing time well, but oftentimes they're just not feeling that time passing. Often we get into hyperfocus, which is a state where we are very locked into what we're focused on, and we can be there for hours. And a lot of people don't understand this about ADHD because they're like, attention deficit, what? Like how are people so focused with ADHD? But it is really, ADHD is an issue with attention regulation. So we can either be very, very locked in or struggling to pay attention at all. But oftentimes that hyperfocus plays into the issue with perceiving time. We also have struggles with really being able to see an overview of how long a project will take or the components that are a part of that. So that can mean that we might commit to a task thinking, okay, we have 2 weeks to do that. That's plenty of time, but there's all these pieces to the task that we didn't perceive, and we just did not give ourselves the time and bandwidth needed to be able to do that.
And even the concept of time and having to make an appointment on time and then work your way backwards and then use planning, it's more executive functions than just time itself. So I want to ask you, if somebody feels like they're always rushing or they're constantly behind, what can they do to start to manage their time better?
I think breaking down routines is really helpful. Having micro routines for times of day that seem to give you trouble with the time. So if you're, if that's getting out the door and you're always like, you get to the office on time, but you feel like you ran a marathon to get there because there was always some stressful thing you weren't anticipating, try to really do everything you can to find a routine that's intuitive, because then it takes the decision and the thinking out of the process. Oftentimes with that time and the executive function of decision making is tough too. So if we're in the morning having to pick out an outfit, we can lose track of time in our closet deciding between 3 things. And we feel like we've been in there for 3 minutes, but it's been 20, and then everything's behind. So thinking about, can I choose outfits the night before, or can I have a more uniformed approach to how I dress? So it's a little more intuitive. So kind of reducing the number of decisions that need to happen in a routine can really help. Oftentimes for things like not making it to meetings in time and things like that, I do a double alarm. So I set an alarm about 20 or 30 minutes before, and I hear that alarm and I think, okay, I'm gonna have to stop soon. So if I'm hyper focused on something, it's like my brain gets a little warning. And then when that second alarm goes off, I'm less likely to ignore it or be like, oh, I got to really wrap this up because I'm already starting to wrap something up. And then I'm able to transition into that meeting on time. So thinking thinking about those pieces, I often find sometimes with time management, we can overcorrect that big time. That can be a people-pleasing thing too, where I was that person that was always excessively early because I got so used to like that frazzled feeling of being on time, but showing up feeling like I, was just really exhausted just getting there, or the stress of being late. So I would show up to things 20 or 30 minutes early, and that causes its own level of stress, and you lose a lot of time in that. So not just asking the question around how can I be more on time, but think about how am I thinking about the time leading up to having to be somewhere or be in a space, and what can I do to kind of find those stumbling blocks and make them a little easier for myself.
Yeah. I know about the being early. So if I have to be somewhere at 3:15, I tell my brain it's 3:00 and I set everything by 3:00. I also have to say, I wonder if this is true for you, but I find this true for other people with ADHD, is that if the appointment is at 3:05 or it's at 3:20, like that does not exist. Like that is not a thing. You are either at 3:00 or you're at 3:15. But these other things like that you're trying to schedule for me. So I will always be like, it has to be like 3:00, 3:15, 3:30, somewhere in, the 15 increments. But my husband, I'll say, oh, we have to be there by 3. And he'll be like, it's 3:15. Like, why are you saying that? Look, it's 3:15 on the calendar. I'm like, no, you just sabotaged my brain, because odds are, if I say 3:00, I'm making it at 3:15. Like that's what's going to happen. And so I already know that.
We're not always building in that buffer. I think it can be really helpful too to have that external processing of time with someone. So if you're going to the airport and you want to be there at a certain time, talking it through with someone, or even AI, if you don't have that person to talk it through, I often forget, okay, how long is it going to take to park? How long is it going to take to, take the bus over from the economy lot? There's so many steps that I think we are only looking at like, okay, here's the drive time over to this place. We're not naturally putting those other steps in. So kind of sanity checking your plan with somebody can really help, so that they're like, oh no, it's going to take you at least 15 minutes to walk in. Or if it's a new place, finding it. That's something I didn't do today and was a little bit late to this meeting. So we can get better with it when we practice it, but also just allowing yourself a little bit of grace when it doesn't work out the way you need it to, and just learning for next time. But I always think of, for me, yes, other people are impacted by being a little bit late here or there, but I'm the one that's usually mostly impacted because of the stress of that and how that feels to be late. So thinking about it as kind of like a service to yourself, it's almost like self-care, to take that extra time to kind of nail down those routines and set yourself up for success to, be able to arrive on time a little more often.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying, leveraging AI. It's so interesting to me because it's such a split right now. And people are like, oh, you shouldn't use the AI. And yet I find both people who have ADHD and autism, they are leveraging AI in a way that's helping them support their lives that never existed. Like saying to AI, this is my, outline a morning routine. Okay, this is what I also do in my morning routine. Okay, could you put a time estimate to that? Okay, can you make it a PDF printout? And then you can print it out and you can put that up. This is something, that I manually had to do because this before AI for my son, of like, every morning we need to brush our teeth, we need to wash our face, like then you need to go get clothes, and like having those steps there. And, for the average individual, they might be like, oh, that's like, why would you need that? And it's because it's easy to miss steps, or it's easy to get distracted, hyper-focused on something else, especially as, he's now a preteen boy, and it's like, oh, if the remote's out, I could just turn on the TV. And now it's like, we've forgotten that anything else needs to be done. I want to shift the conversation. You brought up emotional regulation earlier. What's something most people are misunderstanding about emotional dysregulation when it comes to ADHD?
I think there's a lot that we don't really focus on. And part of that is because emotional regulation is actually not part of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be, and then it was taken out mainly because it was hard to measure and hard to quantify.
I want to stop right there because I want to highlight that the DSM is mostly changed for the comfort and the ease of practice for the practitioner and not based on the experience of the individual. And I think that's really important because people will say, that's not in the DSM, so emotional dysregulation isn't real, Meredith. Why are you talking about that with ADHD? That's not in the DSM. The DSM didn't even allow for the diagnosis of ADHD and autism. I believe it was like 2016 when they finally allowed it. And the whole reasoning why they never allowed it is because they thought it was too hard for the clinician to be able to differentiate these. So sorry to interrupt you, but I just really need people to understand that the DSM is for the practitioner and it is not encompassing the experience of the individual.
I am so glad you interrupted to share that because that is such an important point. And that is, I think it's just the inequity of the system could be a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
But bringing it back to the emotional regulation piece, we don't talk about it enough because of that very reason. And what's interesting, though, is working in this field and interacting with experts, many of them that are physicians and neuroscientists, they all agree that it should be something that we are studying and understanding and part of that diagnostic criteria. It's actually something the psychiatrist that evaluated my daughter noticed in the appointment and pointed out to me before we knew any of that. So people that understand ADHD understand that this is absolutely a huge part of ADHD. Again, it's under that umbrella of regulation. It's hard to regulate our attention. It's hard to regulate our emotions. There's several studies that show that people that are neurodivergent have a smaller zone of tolerance. So your zone of tolerance is that space where you are calm. It's not that there's not stressors present. It's that you can navigate those stressors and that you're able to stay, just like it sounds, regulated. Mm-hmm. And then we often are pushed out of that zone more easily, and our zone is just smaller. So that sometimes looks like being really temperamental, like very extreme emotions, but it also can look like feeling more flat. You can go up or you can go down outside of that zone of regulation. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to talk about because I give people strategies all of the time. But if you are chronically overwhelmed, you're probably dysregulated. You're not going to be able to do any of the strategies I give you when you're not in a state of regulation. So if we don't address that, none of the things that we give clients or we give ourselves to manage our symptoms are going to be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. That was one of the first things that was noticed about your daughter, because in my son, that was the first sign for me, is the extreme emotional dysregulation, the big feelings, the big outbursts, and the small zone of tolerance. And that's when I was like, we need to look into this. Like, there's something here. There's something going on. I want to talk about that zone of tolerance. If we know the zone of tolerance is small, what can we do about it?
So there are everyday things that you can do to increase your zone of tolerance. Spending more time in nature, mm-hmm. exercise, spending time in community, laughing, all of those things help us widen that zone of regulation. Those are those things that fall under that self-care umbrella that so many of us have a really hard time finding time to fit in. Mm-hmm. So thinking of those things that kind of build up your tolerance over time. And then you also want to build your library of skills to notice when you're moving out of that zone, to catch it faster. Because usually there's signs. Oftentimes they're physical. It's things like you start feeling hot or you start getting a little bit of a headache. Noticing those things faster and having ways ways to downregulate. And then also noticing when you're in those patterns where you don't have enough stimulation to feel regulated, where you don't feel like you can initiate tasks when you're kind of feeling really low, and having tools that kind of can bring you up into that zone where you can focus and navigate things a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, the taking breaks is so important. And as the top of this conversation, we talked about people pleasing. And I think women, they forget to take breaks. They forget to put themselves first. Maybe they don't forget, but they don't prioritize it. And it's certainly something that I think a lot of society likes to send women this message of like, you're inferior because of your hormones, like you can't keep up with men. Men are cycling their hormones on a day-to-day basis, right? I like to call it the sun. It's up and it's down. It's pretty boring. So I don't work in men's health. Super boring. Not enough stimulation for me. Women, we're going to be cycling roughly on that lunar cycle. So on that moon cycle. So if you think about the moon phases, that's you. You have all of these phases that you go through. And there's this message that during your luteal phase, you should suck it up. You should push through. And that is something where, my message to neurodivergent women is that this is a built-in for a break system. Like your hormones have you in go, go, go mode for the first half of the cycle. And we are meant to take breaks as humans. And as women, we get gifted that time of like, yes, your emotional regulation is going to be a little bit less. You're not going to be able to multitask and do, 50 things in your mind like you were doing 2 weeks ago. And that's permission to pause. That's not something is wrong with you. But I think because we try to push through that, and I say we because I can know all of this and then I fall into that trap again, but we try to push through, right? Or like sometimes life is happening and it's day 27 of your cycle and your period's coming and you're like, well, I still have to be at this meeting. I still have to give this presentation. That's when we start to find ourselves really feeling like the pull of all of this. And I bring this up in the conversation of emotional dysregulation because it's that PMS and even like the PMDD symptoms, they feel so extreme. And sometimes adding in, so this is not like all you have to do is go out in nature and do all the things that you're saying and you'll be fine. It is adding those in by subtracting the things that don't really need your attention, taking those out, that you can feel more regulated in that time. And that's the medicine that doesn't have to happen in the doctor's office.
Yeah, I think a lot of managing ADHD, especially in women, is understanding your patterns and making the shifts you can to honor your capacity, because it is not the same every single day. And we've been taught for so long, living in a capitalistic society, that we should be able to show up at work at the same time, work the same amount of hours, and just always be on. And we aren't designed that way. And if we have ADHD, we've got this extra set of struggles with that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's something that all women struggle with. But I think with ADHD, we have to really think about that and think about how we what kind of agency do we actually have with our job or our personal life and our family to honor that a little bit more? Because I don't think most of us if we work for the corporate world, they're not going to be like, okay, yeah, it's cool if you work, half days during the second half of your cycle. We get it. I think it would be wonderful if we got there. But thinking about if you have a little bit of control over your workload, like I am focused a lot on writing right now, and my brain is not that great after I ovulate. Like it feels like I am a different person for those couple of weeks in a month. So knowing that, I try to structure most of my writing when I am earlier in my cycle and I feel more creative and it's just easier to initiate. So it takes a lot less bandwidth. I can write at other times and I have, but when I'm not writing for a deadline, I try to move the creative projects there and then put the other things that are just requiring less brain power and energy in that second half of my cycle. And I'm lucky that I have flexibility in my job to do that. But I think a lot of us can kind of look for ways we can think about that in our life and understand what our capacity is and not try to fight it so much.
I feel this so hard right now because I'm working on a book right now and there's deadlines and chapters due, and I ovulated and I'm like, great, I don't feel and any time though I do get the like, okay, I feel like writing, like I got to go in on it. But one thing for people who are like, well, what do you do when you just have to do it? Is that, so for writing, for example, yes, I'm writing this in my luteal phase. My brain, it's more work. It honestly is more work. Things don't flow as well. I can always revisit it and edit back in that follicular phase, back when my estrogen is up. It's honestly something that where I was just like, man, I just feel like I should just take some estrogen so I can power through this. And I'm like, yeah, that would be great. I'd love to see the fallout of doing that in your cycle. So nobody, don't do that. It was just my thought of like, oh, if I just had my estrogen ally, I would be doing so much better. I want to talk to you about the ADHD shame spiral, because after you have a bout of emotional dysregulation, maybe you lash out to somebody, maybe you cry in front of people, that can feel embarrassing, that there can be this shame. Like, I feel so ashamed. How do you coach people through that ADHD shame spiral?
That's a really hard one because I think it really can be painful when our symptoms put us in a situation that we regret saying something or acting in a certain way. I think it's Brene Brown that says shame dies in the light. I think I really encourage people to find that safe person to talk about it with. If you maybe have that coworker that was there having that conversation versus ruminating on the interaction for weeks and days and months, getting things out into the open, I think is much better for our brains than keeping it internal. Sometimes you might be surprised at the perception. It might be, oh, I didn't even notice that you did that. Or, oh no, it actually made me feel good to see you have tears and emotions because I feel like I was suppressing that. You might be surprised at the outcome, or you might have a conversation that leads to a better way of interacting in the environment that triggered that reaction. But I think we really have to talk about the fact that people with ADHD, one of the things we really struggle with is rumination, which, if you're not familiar with that term, it's overthinking. Our brains tend to stay kind of in that like thinking, processing mode. There has actually been studies that show that there's a network in the brain called the default mode network. They often refer to it as the DMN. So all people have this network, but that's when we're kind of like at rest and we're thinking things through. And then there's this other network called the task positive network, the TPN, that when we start doing a task and we're involved in something, the DMN turns down in like a neurotypical individual. So with people with ADHD, our DMN doesn't turn down as much when we're involved in a task. So that means that while we all can overthink and we can all ruminate, we're doing it much more often. And we're not getting that brain break when we're like, oh, I can just keep busy and do this thing and kind of forget this ever happened. No, we're still thinking about it. So if we want to break those cycles of rumination, oftentimes we do need to, get it out in the open and talk to the people that were involved and try to repair in that way. But our brain's going to tell us that's not the solution, that we should stay over here and keep ruminating. So being aware of that tendency is really important.
Yeah. And I talked about this. I did a episode on ADHD sleep issues specifically in perimenopause, because it's like you don't sleep because of, delayed sleep phase syndrome here with ADHD. And then you add perimenopause hormones on it, and now you're not sleeping even more. But that rumination can be really problematic. And that's when so many of my patients have said, like, when I'm falling asleep, my brain just won't shut off. What are you thinking about? Are you thinking about to-do lists? No, I'm thinking about that thing that I did when I was 6 years old, and I really wish I never did it. And all I can think about, and I'm like, hey, I've been there. I know this. I know this well. And so it is something that I want people to know it is really common experience. And it is something to recognize that it's a huge drain on your energy. I don't think we talk enough about how exhausting it is to live as a neurodivergent person in a neurotypical world. And that's one of those reasons as well, of like analyzing every action that you've ever done and how could you do it better. I do want to talk about the pause though, because you brought that up earlier about pausing before you speak. But How do you help people who are having a hard time with overreacting or reacting quickly? How can they take a pause to not go into reactive mode first?
I think it takes a lot of practice. You have to identify what your kind of exit strategy is before you need it. So if you know that there's certain things that trigger you at work or trigger these responses at home, thinking about that and thinking about how can I notice faster and have a pause or have some language that allows for that pause. So we use this a lot in our home with communication because, we've got 5 people and 3 of them have ADHD. So there's a lot of, emotional regulation issues happening. And our past pattern was everybody gets so hot and we continue trying to get our point across and yelling and it's just not good, right? So we've identified language being like, I feel like I need a break and I'll approach you when I feel more regulated. And when you're regulated, please let me know as well. So we can have this discussion in a productive way.
Do you guys actually get to say all of that?
I mean, my kids are older, so I think that's important to know.
It's because we just have code word dysregulated.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't always
and if
sound.
somebody says that in the house, we're like, give space, dysregulated, give space. And so it's like, you actually are able to have that whole conversation. You guys have been practicing.
I mean,
it
sometimes works really well. Sometimes it looks more like I have to leave. And sometimes there's just door being slammed to make a point, Yeah. And I think sometimes too, it's like, as a parent, when the language isn't used by the child and it is more of like the walking away, slamming the door, I'm able to just let that go because I know that she is really trying to do what's best for her in that moment, but she's just not at a point yet where she can skip the door slam. When I was a kid, I did a lot of door slamming, and that was additional punishment and additional negative feedback for how I reacted instead of really getting to the root of the thing that you were trying to work through that was causing the dysregulation. So yes, it's not perfect. I think if we practice those things ahead of time, oftentimes when I've worked with clients that are really struggling with that, they'll do that as like a morning routine. They'll do some gratitude work and then they will rehearse language for conversations. And as you practice these things in real life, it gets more natural and you don't always have to have this canned speech. But if you never think about that language until you're in the moment, the language is not going to be very kind. So I think the pause starts to happen the more you practice and the more you're aware that you need it. And oftentimes I think that we're trying to regulate in the moment when we really need to kind of be somewhere where the trigger is not for a time to get back into regulation. Oftentimes people are like, don't, leave the conversation until things are resolved, when sometimes we all need a break so that we can get back to a place where it's productive.
Yeah, I agree with that. I appreciate you saying that because you hear that so often. And I know somebody once upon a time said if you want to stay married, never go to bed angry. And I'm like, well, sometimes you're going to go to bed angry because that message to me was always push down your emotions. Don't deal with your emotions, because even when you still talk about things, you can start getting dysregulated again. And then you feel that in your system. And then I think it's really easy. I mean, I feel like younger me was like, oh, I feel so guilty and I'm going to ruin my marriage. And I don't think I've been married 15 years now, but I was so paranoid because I'm no, but I still feel I feel angry. And it's not even necessarily still angry with this person as much as the feeling is still there. It has to, and it's when, as I matured, I learned you have to let emotions run their course and run through your body. And I'm someone, so in our house, we have the I am dysregulated. It's often because, I've modeled this. So this definitely comes from me because I'm in the kitchen and I'm cooking and I'm trying to do all the things. And then I'm being talked to and someone's banging a pot and all this. And then I'm wait a minute, it's upon me. I'm dysregulated and I have to leave and take this little break. Something we do in our house. So with the older one, he's not so much cool with the trampoline, but the toddler is let's go bounce on the trampoline for a while. I'm someone that I've got to do jump squats. What I want people to understand, and this is what I explain to patients, is that when your nervous system gets into the sympathetic drive, fight, flight, freeze. Ask yourself, like, what does it want? What does it want to do? And a lot of times it's like, I want to fight. I want to run away. Let's give your body what it needs. So it wants to actually move and move in that way. But I really love that you guys have been working on it so long that your family can have that dialogue and actually get to that place of discussion. I think that's a really beautiful thing to be modeling to people of something that's possible.
Yeah, I don't want to put the image out there that we're perfect and that we don't fight.
I didn't get that
yeah. I just want to be clear here. My teenage daughter will call me on it and be like, "No, we just got in a fight last week." And to me, it's not eliminating these things happening. These things will happen. We will get dysregulated. We will say things that we regret saying, but understanding the root of it and giving ourselves more of a chance to have less of these situations and then knowing how to repair is really, really important.
Yeah. And for people listening, I will link to Dr. Anne Louise Lockhart's episode because she talked about how bad it is to yell at your kids. How, we know that physical punishment is damaging to a child. So spankings, she talked about yelling, and something we talked about in that is like, okay, well, everybody's going to lose it at some point, right? Some people might be freezers, right? That's how their sympathetic nervous system works. So they just shut down, which is also damaging to a child, right? What can we not do, right? To the kid that isn't something. Well, she gave tips. And one of the things was like showing them and modeling them when you feel like you've misbehaved and you've acted out of character from who you would like to show up in this world. Model to them what an apology looks like, how redemption can be achieved. And I thought that is just so powerful. I want to shift the conversation to motivation because I think that's the other thing. We often get labeled as like unmotivated, right? Unmotivated, lazy. No, I just don't want to do the boring, meaningless stuff that I don't think has a point, right? That was me in school. Like, what's the point of this? If you can't tell me why this is worth doing, then I'm not going to do it. It's if you have a child that's a troublemaker, let me be an example of what troublemakers can look like when they grow up. What actually drives motivation in the ADHD brain, and why is it sometimes that rewards will backfire?
I think it's such an interesting conversation. We have such a complicated relationship with motivation because oftentimes there are those things that we just really struggle to initiate and we get that label of lazy. But then we have this other side of us that is like so motivated to the things that we're interested in. So what they think is happening in the ADHD brain is that we have our dopamine receptors process dopamine much more quickly than a neurotypical brain. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's involved in a lot of things, but one of those things is motivation. Mm-hmm. So when we're thinking about a task that is kind of boring, like, doing laundry or something like that, a neurotypical person is going to get some dopamine in their brain thinking, oh, it's going to feel good to get this done, or I can check this off my list and that feels good. And that's enough dopamine for them to do the thing. Whereas an ADHD person, that they might get that like little feeling of, oh, I want to do my laundry, I want to get it done. And then that dopamine is processed so fast before they can even initiate that task. So they're having to be like, let me find a new podcast to listen to, or they're having to jump through all of these hoops to try to be motivated to things that it's much more intuitive for other people to be motivated towards. So that's, I think, where we get.
Are people really motivated to do their laundry?
I don't think anyone likes it, but I do think for some people, it's just, they know it's something that needs to be done. They see the importance of it. I often say that the trickiest thing about ADHD is our brains are not always motivated by importance. They're motivated by interest. Mm-hmm. So if we've got all of these tasks on our list and we know that this one thing we really need to wear clothes tomorrow and we're on our last pair of shorts, like, why aren't we getting up and doing the laundry? But we have this other task, like researching a topic that we're really interested in. Our brain's going to tell us, no, this is the important thing, when it's really not in that moment what we need to be doing. Mm-hmm. So that can be really tough. And I think it's really tough with people that are diagnosed later in life because they have these like two parts of themselves where they're like, why can I be so motivated towards this one thing, but I can't keep my home functional, or I can't submit my expense report. Those things I think are really confusing. And I think oftentimes we oversimplify it. Like lazy is such an interesting term to me because it just doesn't apply to most people with ADHD, because oftentimes too, we do want to be keeping our home cleaner. We do want to not be getting in trouble at work. We do want to get reimbursed for that expense. So we're having a hard time doing things we actually want to do. And if you're lazy, I think it's avoiding things that you just totally don't want to do, right?
Yeah. I just have to laugh because it's so the autistic part of me needs the house to be organized and everything in its place. Like people, I cohabitate with many people, and the people moving the stuff in the pantry, like my husband will see it. I walk in there and I'm like, oh, and he's like, oh my gosh, okay, somebody moves stuff on you. I'm like, yeah. But then the ADHD side of me is like, I can wash and I can dry clothes. I cannot get over the finish line. I've actually had to, it's interesting because, there's the whole argument around autism and it's like, oh, well, you're a low accommodations person. I'm like, well, am I? Because I have to hire people to come into my house and help me. Like I can't get across the finish line of getting the clothes folded and getting them put in drawers. And there's all of these tasks that happen in the house that I'm like, I can't get them done. And I have tried all of the watch TV while you fold clothes, but then I get really bored with TV. And so it is this struggle. And something else as you were talking that came up for me is how we hear these silly things that are like successful people make their bed every morning. And I think for people with ADHD, they hear that and they think, well, I can't make my bed. I'm someone who's like, there's a fitted sheet and there's a comforter and that is done. Okay. We can't do more than that. People will hear that though. And they think they hear these successful people say these things, they make their bed every morning. They always have their clothes folded neatly. And then you hear that and you think well, then I can't be successful. And it's not true. Success looks really different. And I will tell you, I've met many very successful people who are sometimes they never roll in clothes that are not completely wrinkled. And I see that and I'm like, friend, same. So I think, this talk around motivation is helpful for people to understand how things can look differently for them. I want to ask you what are the most effective tips you share with clients for managing impulsivity, and how that gets in the way of their motivation?
Yeah, I think it is really important to think about every day, what your why is for that day, because we will be governed by that impulsivity if our why isn't strong enough.
Yeah.
So you talked about being the kid that's like, I don't want to do this thing if I don't know why I have to do it. And thinking about the things like your bed, I am actually the same way where I'm like, I don't need to make my bed. My husband likes to make the bed, so I let him do it. And I've let go of the fact that if I were a better wife, that's something I'd be doing. It's important to him. It's not important to me. So when he's out of town, I just kind of pull that comforter over and we move on. But thinking about every day and thinking about what are my top priorities and why are these my top priorities, I think can help a lot with that impulsive need to just kind of follow what our brain wants to do in the moment. I really like a transition routine to transition me into my day and out of my day. And usually that looks like in the morning, thinking about, okay, what did I identify the night before as my priorities? So it's almost that double check. If you are closing out your workday and thinking about, okay, tomorrow, what do I want? You're building that vision and then you're revisiting it in the morning, and it's going to be easier to have a little more control over those impulses. I also think sometimes it's okay to follow your impulses. Every once in a while, I like to give myself a day where I don't have any deadlines and I am able to just follow what my heart tells me to do that day. It feels really freeing. I had a client that was kind of struggling with that, where she was like, I know I do better with routines and plans, but then sometimes I just want to rebel. And she identified trying to fit in a half day each week that she called her blah day. And she could just be like, blah. I'm just going to do whatever I want. I don't have to follow the rules. And she found herself, sometimes she would do the routines anyway because she was craving it. But other days she let herself just kind of follow the impulses. And when you give yourself kind of like that little bit of a leeway, I think it's easier to have some more control over them the rest of the time.
Do you think that's a bit of pathological demand avoidance? Because sometimes it's like, I know I need to do these things, like here's the routine. And I definitely love routines and I get really, I dysregulated if routines get interrupted. But then sometimes if somebody's like, oh, you have to do this or you should do this, it like lights up. And I can even do it to myself where I'm like, oh, you should do this and you should do that. And then my brain's like, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do any of that. So I wonder if like those like permission of like having the blah day is something that would work for people with PDA as well.
Yeah, I do think with PDA, we do have to have time away from the demands. We can't have it demand all of the time. We need some freedom within our routines to be able to have choice. I think PDA can be really hard. I get like that too. As a kid, I would just say, like, I just don't like being told what to do, even if that telling was something that was going to be good for me and benefit me. So I think that, and again, I think we impulsively resist at times versus taking the pause and being like, okay, so maybe we didn't like how that demand was phrased by someone or from ourselves. Maybe we need to approach it from a different angle. I think it's easier in adults as kids because we can be a little more irrational than that. But, I found that with exercise with myself as I was very into marathon running for a really long time. And I did really well with a very solid training plan until I didn't, until I got older and I needed more recovery than what the system, was telling me I needed to do for miles. And when I took a break, it was like, I wanted to just do things my way, and I just couldn't bring myself to have that structure again. And I had to slow down and be like, I was telling myself, just follow the plan, but until I took the time to be like, why am I being so resistant to this? And identify that like, oh, that was because that being so rigid on that hurt you in the past. So like do that self-collaboration where you find that answer. And I think if you're dealing with a kid that shows the signs of that PDA profile, it is kind of like that collaboration versus always being a like directive parent. I think it helps a lot when we can get the buy-in from that person. And sometimes that person is ourselves that we have to get that buy-in from.
It's funny that you said like, I don't like to be told what to do. Before I was diagnosed, I would be like, what's the rule in the house? And my son and my husband both knew. It was like, don't tell mom what to do. I'm like, yes. And I identified that early on that I'm like, if you tell me what to do, like my nervous system's like, you're attacking me and I'm angry. Is it rational? No, it's not rational. It's how my nervous system's wired. But that was one of our code things for them to reframe it of like, hey, what do you think about doing this? Or wouldn't it be nice if we had this, and just doing a reframe? And then my nervous system's like, yeah, let's do it. Like, this is great. I'm like, this is so silly, but it's so real. It's such reality. So for people listening, PDA, pathological demand avoidance, this is where, just like we're saying, you tell someone what to do and their nervous system lights up and is like, can't, won't. It's not even conscious. It's not something that they're deciding. It's what their entire existence is like. It's like one rebellious nervous system against yourself as well. When somebody is struggling with that and they know they have to get something done, what are some tips to help them?
I think being aware of it and having language around it is absolutely important. We didn't really start talking about PDA until like the last couple of years. So recognizing that is very important. And then I think it is always coming back to the purpose. People that show that profile need to know the why big time. And if you can't identify a why, then you're not going to be able to meet that demand. Sometimes we have to think about what is it about this demand that is feeling so uncomfortable to me? Is it that I'm worried I'm not going to feel good? Like for an example I see a lot is my son is very demand avoidant. And it's so heartbreaking as a mom because he'll get invitations to play dates and things like that. And he will almost immediately be like, no, I don't want to do that. And he's very social, but oftentimes he's like, well, I'm worried I'll be tired from school, or I already have football tonight and I don't want to do this other thing. It's like he has like a set amount of demands that he can tolerate. And once we kind of identified that and accepted that versus like packing things in, it's worked a lot better. I've noticed that with myself is that like when I'm going through a period of time where I have tons of meetings on my calendar and my time doesn't feel like I have much control over it, that's when I have to lessen demands elsewhere. Like there's only so many demands that a lot of us are willing to tolerate. So thinking about, okay, why am I doing this? Getting back in touch with the benefit, completing the task will give you, and also just looking at your kind of bandwidth to have those external demands and kind of shifting if there's just too much at a certain time.
Mm-hmm. I love the, cataloging, like how many demands can I take in the day? I think that's really important. I feel like it took me too long in life to realize that like, if it's more than 3 big things I have to do outside of my house, like I'm going to be completely wiped out. And so I know that it's like, if I have to go to a doctor's appointment and I have to do the Costco trip and I'm going to have to go to like a parent teacher conference, that's it. Don't schedule any other big going outside the house, doing other things. Don't think like, oh, I can just stop by the pharmacy on the way or anything like that. And to say that it might not catch up with you that day, it might catch up with you a few days later. And this is the thing that's so tricky about being a human, is that the things that often have impacted how we're feeling in this current moment, they already happened a week ago, a month ago. And here we are, and we don't think back to that. And we just wonder like, well, what could possibly be wrong? So I love that tip of like, understand how many demands like you can really take on in a day. I think the same is true with like decision fatigue. So you gave the great tip of like, before bed, pick out the outfits. Because first thing in the morning, you have to think about getting breakfast. You start thinking about all of these things, and I feel like you can only make so many decisions in the day. And this is something that I will say to my team sometimes, like, I have made a lot of decisions today. I need, like this one, you have to come back to me tomorrow, because I just feel like I'm going to give you an answer and none of us are going to be happy with it. So let's try again tomorrow when my brain is fresh and actually has a little more capacity.
Mm-hmm. I think just understanding that is so important and being able to communicate that.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. We are going to link to where you coach ADHDers. We will link to your book and all of your resources. But I want to say thank you so much for sharing your expertise and taking the time to sit down with us today.
It was great. I was so happy to be here.
Thank you so much for joining the conversation. If you could like, subscribe, or leave a review, it helps me so much in getting this information out to everyone who needs it. If you enjoyed this conversation, then I definitely want you to check out this.